Throttles. This is a tutorial on how to set up your throttles in the Blackbird C-130J. First, let's discuss how the throttles work in the real aircraft. The throttles have four separate ranges from aft to forward. We have reverse, which goes from max reverse to a push-through detent at ground idle. Then we have the ground range, also called the beta range, which goes from ground idle to flight idle. At flight idle, there is a lift to return detent. This means that if you are in the flight range, you'll need to lift the throttles over the stop in order to move them aft and into the ground range. This will be important later. Moving forward, we have the flight range, which is divided into the auto throttle range between flight idle and max continuous thrust, and the takeoff range, which goes from the push-through detent at max continuous all the way up to full power takeoff. If you're above the max continuous thrust detent, the auto throttle servos will not engage the throttles, and you'll need to move the throttles back to max cont before the auto throttle will take effect. That's how it works in the real aircraft. There is one continuous axis with two push-through detents and one lift-to-return detent. What does this mean in the sim? Well, it depends on what kind of hardware you have. First thing to do is to set up your throttle axis using the default sim system, same as you would for any aircraft. I'm using a Thrustmaster Warthog, which only has two levers, so I map throttles 1 and 2 to my left throttle and 3 and 4 to my right throttle. Now let's go to the tablet and select Hardware and Throttle. Here you can see the three different detents. Max cont is in blue, flight idle in red, and the ground idle is in green. The default settings are based on the geometry of the real aircraft. That means the default settings have the detents at the same percentage of throttle travel as on the real deal. The only reason to change them would be to match the settings on your hardware. If your throttle has a detent near the aft end of the axis, say here, well then I can click the flight idle detent to move the flight idle detent to match my hardware and allow me to use that detent for its intended purpose. That's the only reason to actually move any detent, in my opinion. Two important settings. Reverse on axis. In the real aircraft, you engage propeller reverse not by lifting some other lever, but simply by moving the throttle axis aft. It means that it can be hard to find ground idle, especially if your hardware doesn't have a detent there. If you turn off reverse on axis, If you turn off reverse on axis, then you can use the default flight sim reverse thrust controls to move the throttle into and out of the reverse range. Now the number of detents on that calibration screen changes to 2, and ground idle is assumed to be the after end of the axis, and you will either need to hit F2 or some other key or button you've assigned to further reduce the throttles into the reverse range. Or you'll need to toggle reverse thrust mode in the sim, which allows you to increase reverse thrust by moving your throttle levers forward. The bottom line for all of this is that unless your sim setup happens to have a detent at the right place, then this is a problem with no perfect solution. Lock-in flight range when airborne works along similar lines. If you don't have a detent in the right area on your hardware, then it can be a bit hard to find flight idle. And the consequences of accidentally moving the throttles into beta on the C-130 while in a certain speed range can be disastrous. At the very least, you'll get a master warning, but you might also get a loss of AC power and or an immediate stall and crash. In the real aircraft, it's not impossible to do, but it's also easy not to, due to the liftover detent. If your throttle doesn't have a detent, then you probably will want to select lock-in flight range while airborne to prevent this. This will prevent the throttles from moving into the ground range unless you have weight on wheels. Note that after you land, assuming your throttles are all the way back at the stop, you may need to move them just a bit to allow the throttles in the sim to go to the correct position. And that's pretty much all there is to it. Thank you for watching this video. And that's all there is. That's all, folks.